Good afternoon, students and faculty members. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have with us Professor Jeffery Kaplan. I have a very special bond with Professor. He's like a mentor to me, and he has been there for me throughout my career for guidance and any advice that I have needed that he has helped with me that. I would just give a brief introduction of Professor and then we would start. So Professor Kaplan right now is engaged with Danube Institute. He's a distinguished fellow there, and he's a visiting professor at Óbudai University. He has published more than 20 books and hundreds of articles, and his area of specialties or expertise are religion, terrorism, radicalization, and right-wing populism, and waves of terrorism as well. So, and it's an honor to have him with us. And Professor, it's over to you, please.
Thank you. And for everyone, salam alaikum. You have no idea how good it is to at least be virtually back in Pakistan. I taught at Habib for University for a year, and it would have been longer, but it coincided with the COVID epidemic.
Yes.
And so everything closed down. So there was really no great point in staying in Karachi. Let me tell you a little more about myself, and the experience that goes into what I want to tell you today. I want to spend most of the time actually listening to you and more in conversation than in lecture. But basically, today, yes, I work at the Danube Institute in Budapest. At the same time, I'm an external expert at ISESCO, which is the Islamic Cultural, Educational, and Scientific Organization in Rabat. So I try to keep one foot in all of the worlds, both in the Islamic world and in the Western world. And I think that's important. A lot of what I do is based on fieldwork. And in the last 6-7 months, I've taken a team of my young researchers from here in Budapest, and we've done field work in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Jordan, in Israel, and in the Palestinian Authority. And that was the latter ones, the Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority were after October 7th. So we were there during the war. I teach my students one thing, or try to get across to them one thing. As you do your research, as you go further into your careers, if you're going to be really successful at what you do, you've got to be able to see the world through the eyes of the other, understand every side of every conflict. The Middle East is not a Hollywood movie. There's not just good guys and bad guys, black and white. It's a messy, complex situation with lots of shades of gray. And you have to approach it on that basis. You have to talk to everyone. And most important, to listen to what they say. One of the biggest, what would I say, findings of the field work we did in Jordan, Israel, and in the Palestinian Authority is that here we have two sides, and this will not be terribly unfamiliar to you, I think. We have two sides that live in two very separate but closely, geographically close locales who do not recognize the other's truths, the other's stories. They live literally meters apart, but they live in separate worlds. And those worlds, especially after October 7th, have become increasingly sealed and closed. So progress or some kind of justifiable peace, some kind of settlement, becomes further away than everywhere simply because one side won't listen to the other and won't recognize the other's truths. I've had a lot of experience in the Middle East conflict. I live, especially in that area. I lived in Hebron through the first Intifada, which was 1986, 1987. In fact, when I went back in quite recently, I found that my old office was in fact converted into Yasser Arafat's office, and it looked a lot better than when I had it. But it gives you an idea of how important Hebron is to this conflict, and we'll talk a little bit about it. This last trip, I told my researchers after Israel to go back to Budapest. And the reason is that the level of violence in the West Bank has gotten so great that I couldn't guarantee their safety. And I was a little worried about them. They were all young 20-something female researchers, and I simply didn't want to take any chances with them. I went myself, perfectly welcome, perfectly safe, but was told over and over again that I was the first Westerner to go there since October 7th. They hadn't seen another Westerner. And I feel comfortable enough that I'm going to go back to Hebron University and teach a short course there in the fall and spend 6 weeks there. And again, feel perfectly at home. But you have to have a foot in all of the world to be able to transcend some of the conflicts and feel that you can do that. Okay, with that background, let me talk a little bit about the subject you're here to hear about.
Yes.
First, the context. Keep in mind that there are historical patterns here which way predate Israel and are as visible today as they were in the early days of Islam. First is the divide between Sunni and Shia. And it is the underpinning, it's like the chord that is playing beneath the surface of the conflict that you're seeing today. This became really obvious when Israel attacked the Iranian embassy grounds in Syria. It was a strategic mistake. In fact, the head of military intelligence resigned. And one of the reasons that he gave was that it was a massive miscalculation to have done it. Iran responded by sending over 300 missiles and drones at Israel. Virtually none of them landed. Out of 300, 3 actually touched ground. Why? Because a lot of them were intercepted en route even before they got to Israel's Iron Dome security system. And who intercepted them? The Saudis, the Jordanians, to an extent, some of the NATO allies who had warships in the area, and the Israelis picked off the rest. Why would Saudi Arabia and Jordan become involved in this conflict? Not because they have great love for Israel. It was the underpinning of the Sunni-Shia conflict and the conflict with Iran. So keep in mind that is the big sound that's going on beneath the headlines. Today, Iran's Shia allies in Hezbollah, in Lebanon, which, by the way, is a very powerful force. They defeated Israel, according to Israel's own military reports in 2006. This is not a small organization. They are facing Israel on its northern border, and its northern towns are all deserted. They've all been abandoned. So the entire north of Israel is virtually abandoned by its citizens, to give you an idea of how big this conflict is. And it's still a low-intensity conflict at this point. They really haven't gone full on into warfare. That's expected by next year, but it hasn't happened yet. You have the Houthis in Yemen, who really don't have a great stake in the game, except that they're Shia and that they are much more dependent on Iran than Hezbollah is. Hezbollah is an independent state within a state. They could do without Iranian support, and if they didn't want to do something Iran wanted them to do, they are powerful enough to say, no, thank you. So far, they haven't. And then there is Hamas, which is kind of the outlier in all this. Hamas is Sunni, but they have no Sunni state support, whatever, in the Middle East. So they had to turn to Iran. And if you look at their media, at Hamas's media now, they've become great fans of, if not Shia Islam, of Iran and its way of doing business. Second, to understand this conflict, there's something that will be less palatable or less acceptable. One is you have to understand what Zionism actually is, and to disentangle Zionism from Judaism. This is more than just a commercial for my own personal belief. This is actually geopolitics at its base. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are not only unacceptable morally, but they make any kind of conflict resolution virtually impossible. One cannot demonize the other and then sit down at the table with them and try to make some kind of a negotiated settlement. Zionism is an old theory. It goes back to the 19th century. It has many forms. Not all Israelis are Zionists, and definitely not all Jews are Zionists. If Zionism is an issue that would take a class in itself, Islamophobia is an even bigger issue and goes back to the Middle Ages and the Crusades. So just like the Sunni-Shia divide, in the West, we're looking at some very deep divisions that way predate the Middle East conflict. You have to keep that out of your analysis. Finally, in terms of background, you have to understand how deeply, utterly, completely dysfunctional the Israeli political system really is, and has been for a long time. It has an electoral threshold of only 5%. And that means that these tiny minority parties from the extremes, and in this day, it's the extremes of the right, and from the Haredim, or the ultra-Orthodox, are able to get into a deeply divided electorate. And essentially, they decide who's going to be the prime minister. And that's how Netanyahu and his utterly corrupt and dysfunctional government has stayed in power for as long as it has. And that's why the war really goes on and is in the form that it is, because two of the most extreme of his cabinet members have threatened to resign if he doesn't go into Rafah, and if he doesn't become more extreme in the West Bank. If those two take their few votes out, the government falls. And Netanyahu, ultimately, who's been on trial for corruption this whole time, and his wife will probably end up in prison. So it's more than a political issue. It's a very personal issue with him. And it gives you an idea of how dysfunctional the Israeli electoral system, political system really is. Okay, background of the conflict. First of all, you all know what the Nakba is, yes? I'm assuming it's yes. It was the 1948, what Israel calls the War of Independence, and what the Arab side calls the Nakba, which is the disaster, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled largely to Jordan and Lebanon. It was with the understanding that as soon as the conflict ended, they'd be able to go home. They didn't. They haven't, and they probably never will. Then there was the Naksa. The Naksa was the 1967 war. 250,000 Palestinians fled. And Naksa is an interesting term because it really means the inconvenience. Where 1948 was a disaster, they thought, it really doesn't matter who rules here in 1967, because they didn't like the Jordanians either. And the few Palestinians who were in Gaza, and there were few at that time, didn't have any greater feelings for the Egyptians. So they figured they'd come in here, they'll rule a bit, and then they'll go away, and we'll eventually have our own state. That didn't work out. By 1968, the first Israeli settlements began to be planted in the West Bank. The first and most important of them was in Hebron, in what later became Kiryat Arba. Another that became quite important was the Etzion block. I've been writing, I just published a book, or it will be out in September, on the settlement movement in Israel. It's called the early Israeli settlement movement, the birth pangs of Gush Emunim, that talks about this history and about Zionism. It's volume 1 of a 3-volume set, to give you an idea of how much there is really to write about in that area. So this is going on, and that meant that Israelis had people on the ground, and that meant securing them. And that immensely complicated the situation. Now, again, as we said, this is not a Hollywood movie with just good guys and bad guys. Right after 1967, the Israeli government simply was willing to give up all of the West Bank. And if Jordan wanted it back, as long as Israel got security guarantees and access to the sea, they could have it. Jordan never called. That was the point where the Khartoum conference took place. And out of the Khartoum conference came the 3 no's: no to Israel, no to negotiations, no to virtually everything. And so there was nobody to give it to. So they kept it. And as the settlements grew and as the population of Israel changed from a largely Ashkenazi, which is a Western-oriented Jew, and authority as the Mizrahi, who are the Oriental Jews, their population began to grow. They were in isolation. They were looked down on by the Ashkenazi. They had much poorer education. They were banished to what were called development towns outside of the cities, and essentially treated very, very badly. That all changed in 1977 with the election of Menachem Begin and Likud with Mizrahi votes. And all of a sudden, what had been the Gush Emunim private settlement movement now became much, much bigger. And the government under Begin took over this idea of settlement, and they had no intention of giving any of the land back. And that's pretty much where we are, they continue today. At the same time, the Palestinian factions under the PLO, led by Fatah, were never able to achieve any kind of unity, whatever. In fact, it became fratricidal, and there was a lot of killing between the factions. Today, Fatah rules, well, I shouldn't say rule because they really don't. Fatah controls the Palestinian Authority. Israel controls the West Bank, is the reality of it. But the Palestinian Authority has a kind of quasi-government. They haven't had elections in quite a long time because of the deep unpopularity and the level of incredible corruption that has happened there. So, for example, Mahmoud Abbas, who is the president, has less than 10% support. You could run a dog and get more than 10% support. It's that bad. At the same time, after 2006, because of this deep unpopularity, Hamas was elected in Gaza, and it was a democratic election. It was a protest vote. Nobody, I think, really knew what was coming. But on their side, Hamas and its allies, like Islamic Jihad, etc., they really never had an interest in governing per se. They wanted to continue the conflict with Israel, and they left the business of government to international organizations like UNRWA, like the NGOs, and that sort of thing. So on both sides, you get a picture of the dysfunction that's going on and how difficult it is to create any kind of agreement in a situation like that. Finally, and most important, the Israeli occupation has become increasingly violent and increasingly repressive. I saw awful things when I was there in the first Intifada. I was back to visit and stay a while in the second Intifada, and it was much more violent. But right now, the violence is systematic and it's terrible. And what's been added to it is a level of sexual violence against Palestinian women that is not reported on very much. Everybody knows about it. And it's something that you have to keep in the background of your mind when we get to the subject of October 7th. Because now you have a population, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, that is angry, it is repressed, the job opportunities are almost nil, the economic situation is terrible, there's a problem with drugs, with young people, and there's a problem with hopelessness. So what do? You leave or you fight. There aren't very many third choices. That's the situation. Then came October 7th. Let me make an argument that I hope you will agree with, but maybe you won't. We'll see when we have the discussion. But the killing of civilians, whether they're Jewish or Muslim or Yazidi or anybody else, is unacceptable. It is not an uprising, an intifada. It's terrorism. It's simply murder for murder's sake. On October 7th, between 1,100 and 1,200 Israeli civilians were killed. 250 were taken hostage to Gaza. And whether you believe it or not, and I'm safely assume that you will not, because no Muslim I've ever talked to in all of my research will believe it. And a lot of Westerners won't, but there was a lot of sexual violence that happened, and there's a lot of evidence of it. And the UN report pretty much documented it as well. I don't want to get into an argument about that, but keep that in mind. Whether you believe it or not, understand that the Israelis believe it. And increasingly, the world community believes it. And they act accordingly. So keep that in mind. Our own beliefs are whatever they are. But we have to look into the eyes of the other to understand what the other is doing, why they act in the way they do. With these pictures in mind, and nobody disputes the killing, because the bodies are everywhere, and you can see it anywhere on social media, of all ages, both genders. It was unbelievable. Israel reacted with the invasion of Gaza, and what amounts to a series of war crimes in Gaza. The killing of civilians, of children, the destruction of houses, the destruction of hospitals. Israel's counter-argument is that Hamas had infrastructure there, and that's true. But Hamas is a sub-state actor, and they engage in terrorism. Israel is a state. The rules are different. A state cannot act in the same way, and Israel more than did. So we have that situation. Internationally, in the immediate wake of October 7th, there was a wave of sympathy and support for the Israelis because of the killing. because of the destruction. After the attack on Gaza, that changed 180 degrees. You have two stories, both of them true, that are being told in two different ways. Throughout the time I was in the Arab world, and we're not talking just a few days, this was almost 2 months of fieldwork. Every time I went into a house, Al Jazeera was on, showing dead children, the destruction of Gaza. In Israel, and when we got back to the West, it was CNN showing October 7th, the killing of Israelis. Two stories, both of them with a lot of truth to them, but one side will not listen to the other. One side will not believe the other. And so here we are. Current strategic situation. And from an Israeli perspective, it ain't good. It's not good at all. They're fighting right now 5 wars. 4 of them are low-intensity conflicts. One of them is an outright war, the war in Gaza. At the same time, they're fighting a low-intensity conflict with Hezbollah in the north, which, as we said before, has depopulated the north. Hezbollah is remarkably powerful. If they wanted to go to full-scale war, I'm not sure how much they would need Iran, to be honest. They are very strong. They conflict on the Golan with largely Syrian groups, backed by Russia and by the Assad government. Low intensity, but enough to further depopulate the north. They can fire a lot of rockets. It used to be said when this was long ago, and when I was living in Hebron, that the Shia, who are the vast majority in southern Lebanon, used to say that we support the Palestinian, the PLO, because they will fight the Israelis to the last Shia. And what they meant is that they would fire rockets and run. And then when the Israeli airstrikes came, it destroyed Shia villages who had nothing to do with it. You're seeing that in Syria too, with, again, vast number of civilian casualties. Keep in mind that the Israeli casualties are heavily documented. Why? Because Western media had access to it. Western media doesn't go into Gaza. Israel controls that. Western media could go into the West Bank, but they don't. Nobody's seen any media there. Well, I was there certainly, and nobody remembers any. They're afraid to go there, or they don't want to offend the Israelis or the Americans. 2 stories being told in 2 vacuums, but this is going on there. The Houthis disrupting shipping, firing missiles, and according to the latest intelligence reports that have been made public anyway, they have the ability to cut the fiber optic cables that enable the internet connections between the region and the West. That would mean millions of us would be unable to watch football in the mornings, for those of us who like to do that. And that would be a disaster for me, for sure. So we have that. Now, with all of this conflict on a larger geopolitical scale, the West is largely turned against Israel. And most recently, the Biden administration in America has told Netanyahu, if you attack Rafah, you'll be doing it with your own weapons because we're not going to supply you. That's a disaster for Israel. On the other hand, these 2 cabinet members have said, if you don't attack Rafah, we'll leave the government and you'll ultimately go to prison. What a great choice. So they will attack Rafah. And in Israel, the polls not only make Netanyahu almost as unpopular as Mahmoud Abbas, but more important, they have an existential choice. And the choice is this. Hamas has, for interesting political and strategic reasons, agreed to return 33 of the hostages, mostly young women, whom the Israelis absolutely assume have been sexually assaulted in Gaza. Whether we know that, we believe it, it doesn't matter. The Israelis believe it. And so the vast majority of Israelis in the last poll said that they would rather have the hostages back than continue the conflict. So they want to hold it. They want to do the ceasefires. They want to get all of their hostages back who are still alive. Most of them are actually dead, either through Israeli aircraft attacks, being killed by Hamas, or in some cases, as Hamas's media has put out with some really effective propaganda films, they started feeding the hostages what the Gazan children were eating in the north, which is basically a little pita bread and a bit of rice a day. And at least one, probably more, died of malnutrition and disease. So again, it motivates most Israelis to want the hostages much more than they want to destroy Hamas right now. So that is where it stands right now. And that's what I have for you. A situation in the Middle East that is deeply conflicted. It's not a Hollywood movie for sure. There's a lot of bad guys. There are a lot of good guys, but there's a whole lot of shades of gray in which people are both. That's what I've got for you. Now, what I was looking forward to are questions and discussions. So let me stop here and turn it back to Dr. Amin.
So thank you so very much, and it was very informative and so many inside things that most of us are unaware of, that you've shared with your field experience. I would ask my students to raise your hand and ask your question. And let me start with the first question that I would want to ask. So you talked about the CNN perspective, and on the other hand, the perspective that we are getting from Gaza as well, the picture they are showing. But at the same time, there were claims that were made by the Israeli authorities, and they even showed some footages that many innocent children were burned alive during the October 7 assault. But through the investigations by the United Nations or even by some other media, there are no facts about it, that the children were burnt alive. So did you get some evidence or any experience about it by being there?
Yeah. The Israelis also put out a video, which they've shown to very few people. I've seen it. It's called 47 Minutes. There are burned bodies of children and even infants. Were they alive? Who knows? There's absolutely no way to know that. Part of the problem is that Judaism and Islam have some real similarities in terms of the religion. They're both peoples of the book. And the Israelis, like Muslims, don't want to bury bodies very quickly. And so they have an organization called Zaka. Zaka are basically very Orthodox Jews who before the war would go to places like awful auto accidents and that kind of thing, clean up the mess of the bodies, and prepare them in the Jewish way for burial very quickly. It has to be within a day, according to Jewish law, if at all possible. And so before there could be real forensic investigation, they came in and started cleaning up the bodies. They did take a lot of pictures, and so did Israeli first responders, and a lot of these are in that 47-minute video. I don't want to argue the degree or whether these children were alive or dead, but they shouldn't have been dead. Does it really matter? And you see the same in Gaza. There's so many children there, many more than were killed in Israel. But the killing of even one child on any side is haram. It's against both religions. And it's unacceptable. So yeah, there is evidence. At the same time, the Israelis have made claims that have been proven false. That one of the big ones was that a pregnant woman was killed, her stomach was cut open, the baby was taken out, the baby was killed. That went around for a while. Then the Israelis themselves said, no, that didn't really happen. That's a mistake. And there's been a lot of that too. You'll always have misinformation. But there is enough evidence to say, yes, it did happen. To what degree, how many, we'll probably never know, just as we'll never know the exact numbers of children or innocent civilians killed in Gaza. It's none of it should have happened.
Hassan Zubairi, please introduce yourself and shoot your question or the conversation that you want to share here.
Please don't shoot, just say it.
Thank God he didn't say you can have a blast.
Yes. I've had enough blasts for the last couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Asif. Thank you, Professor Jeffrey. It was very interesting insights. And I must say, you mentioned that you didn't meet any, particularly a Muslim who could believe on those things. Well, in my opinion, as a practicing Muslim and as a student of social sciences as well as a public relations professional, in a conflict, it's the narrative that is written by the winners. So whatever history or whatever outcome we see is by the winners. My question on this particular topic is: there was a time that Hamas proved that they are a reality, and particularly when they won the elections and they entered into the political arena. They wanted to get engaged in the political process, but at that time it was Fateh and the PLO, under Mahmoud Abbas, that they didn't give them any room. In fact, there was a time that we saw two split governments within the two split regions of Palestine. The Gaza run by the Hamas and the PLO run the West Bank. So and the global community definitely sided with Mahmoud Abbas and PLO, and at that time Hamas was totally sidelined and excluded. I think it was Qatar and some other small governments that they keep on supporting with the concept of the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly, and gave shelter and support to Ismail Hania at that time. My question is why the world community failed to include Hamas as a political reality, accept them as a political reality, and failed to engage them in the political process just the way they did in your words, the corrupt government of PLO?
That's a really good question, and it's a fairly easy one to answer from a Western perspective. The PLO is, whatever its failings, and there are so many we could hardly list them, they are a secular organization. They always have been. They were formed in the 1950s, early 1960s, at a point before the Iranian Revolution and before the turning of Islam into a political force in the Western world and in the Middle East. The governments are comfortable with them because the governments in the West are secular, as are most of the world, as is most of the Middle East. Every Middle Eastern country has it in its constitution, we are an Islamic state. But they don't really mean that. They mean Islam as an identification, not as a form of government. They don't mean Sharia. They don't mean the influence of the ulama. Nothing like that. So they were very comfortable with basically secular, however corrupt, but secular PLO. Hamas has the image of having come from first a criminal organization, long before they became a political organization, and then a part of radical Islam. And there was some truth to this. It was exaggerated for sure, but there was some truth to this. They weren't willing to play by the rules of the West. And so, of course, the West is going to choose the PLO, who are basically very similar. That's the simple reason. Others.
Right. So, Professor, I would like to ask, Hassan, you have just 1 second. Let me just complete and then we will go there. Professor, just one thing that I would want to add here is that what is happening in Gaza, it's terrible. It's terrible whatever is happening. Even recent updates that we have seen that Hamas actually agreed to accept a truce or ceasefire. However, on the other hand, the Israeli government or the Netanyahu government has not agreed to it. And even Hamas says that they would put down their weapons and they would become a political entity if two-state solution is being, moved forward. What do you think about that? Why it's not implicating, or
Well,
why?
the first part.
What is the problem there?
The first part is, as we've already said, it's Israeli dysfunction.
All right.
The great majority of the Israeli public want to do just that. Netanyahu cannot afford to do that because he'll lose power. So on the one hand, there's that. But then there is the wider questions, and there's a Western saying which is absolutely true. There are a few Western sayings that are true, and this is the most true of Western sayings. The devil is in the details. And yes, we have moved now closer than at any time in my lifetime, and as you can see, that's a long time, to the reality of a Palestinian state. But that's a concept. The details. Where would that state be located? Pakistan has some experience in a divide between a geographic divide between parts of your nation. It doesn't work in the long run. There's quite a bit of space between the West Bank and Gaza. Problem number one. Problem number two is who's going to rule it? Who's going to govern it? Who's going to assure security until a government could be formed? And who will recognize it? All of these details are important. So while the Palestinian state is closer than it's ever been, in some senses, it's still still as much a distant dream. So that's the problem. But basically, yes, the Israeli public would be glad to stop with this war and get its hostages back. That's all they want. But the Netanyahu government and the Israeli right wing are not of that opinion. So again, dysfunction. So you can't run a war with a dysfunctional government.
There are lots of complications that need to be.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So we have some of the students who raised their hands. Anas, Simab, and Harisu. Let me start from Anas first. Please, Anas, Unmute your mic and introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you, sir, for such an enlightening session. So I am basically a student of MPhil Intelligence and Security Studies and currently working in civil services of Pakistan. Sir, my question is, it's not a question, basically, it is I would like to have your comment that there's a book written by John Mearsheimer on the influence of Israel lobby on US foreign policy. And he talks about their huge amount of influence on not only on the enactments, but also on the recruitment procedures of the key positions that they do not allow people having known Jewish sentiments to come into the stakeholders of USA. So how far is it, and what is your observation on that? Secondly, sir, it was expected that after Abraham Accords, there's going to be a series of recognition from the Muslim world towards Israel, normalization of ties. But recently, the Gaza conflict has given a new dimension. So what will be the future of Israel getting recognition from the Muslim world? Because in my opinion, I hope that it is going to end sooner or later, this Gaza conflict in months to come, as there are two talks in progress. But what are the long-term repercussions of Abraham Accords in particular? Thank you.
Let me do the second part first, because in some senses it's easier. The Abraham Accords are, in the opinion of every Israeli that I've talked to, and that's quite a few, they're dead. In the view of the Muslims that I've talked to, and this is not just people in the street, interviewed government officials, government leaders, in fact, and in their private view, it's dead. Saudi Arabia was the most recent normalization, moving towards diplomatic recognition. They have backed away because of Gaza. The UAE is pulling away, and they're increasingly open about this. So Gaza has reshuffled the diplomatic cards. And from the Israeli point of view, too, there is a lot less wish to engage with the Arab world after October 7th. There's deep hurt, there's deep anger, there's rage, and there's a thirst for revenge. They're willing to put the revenge off to get their hostages back. But once they get the hostages back, they're much less interested in a Palestinian state and much more interested in destroying Hamas and Islamic Jihad and anybody that gets in their way. It's a very, very bad situation. And it should have been avoided, could have been avoided, but here we are. The question of the power of the Jewish lobby in America. When that book was written, it had a whole lot of truth to it. And it still does. But the power of the Jewish lobby has been declining, and declining fairly sharply. And the thing that really was the breaking point is the Trump administration, that were simply not very interested in the Israeli lobby and in the question of anti-Semitism. They were much more interested in profit and business and that sort of thing. So where that book had a lot of truth, now it has some truth, and it continues to decline. The rate of anti-Semitism in America has gone up precipitously. Attacks on Jews and Jewish communities, Jewish synagogues, have gone up, I don't know how many percent, according to the FBI statistics. As you see the demonstrations at the universities, where they chant from the river to the sea, even though when you ask them, the actual truth is they don't know which river and they don't know which sea, but they look good in a keffiyeh. They're not allowing Jewish students onto their campuses. It's incredible. So the Jewish lobby has become almost irrelevant to the question in the streets. So once it was very true, now it is much less so. They still have influence, but not what they did before, say, 2016. Next.
Right. So now we have Sayyida Simab Heather. Please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. First of all, thank you so much for such an informative session. My question is basically related to the role the global powers are playing in this conflict. For example, I would relate this to as how has the Palestinian-Israeli conflict changed the dynamics of other global conflicts. For example, before October 7, all of the eyes of the West were on the situation in Ukraine. But all of a sudden, the Ukraine conflict has somehow sidelined. And is it because of the role which US is playing in the Israeli conflict, or is it because the role Russia is trying to play in the Middle East?
It's greater than that. You're exactly right. Ukraine was the central conflict. And now it is in media on the back burner. Where I live, it's next door. And so we're in Hungary, we're terribly aware of it. But it's allowed the eyes of the world to focus on the Middle East again. And so Russia is using tactics that were extreme even for Russia's standards. And they'll in the end win the war. I mean, they just numbers and arms and material will out. You're right. The world focuses on one issue at a time. And this has always been true. The focus on Israel and the areas around it, but specifically on Israel, is always intense and always has been because it's the home of the three peoples of the book. We all have important places there. We all have important history there. And it's in all of our books, whether it's Quran and the Night Journey, whether it's the Bible, whether it's the Hebrew Talmud. It all focuses on this one small piece of land, and it's in our consciousness. It's in our prayers. It's in the focus of the international media always. So what happens in Ukraine? Ukraine is a backwater. Israel, the Palestinian conflict, and the Middle East is, in terms of heart and soul, it's the center of the world. And in terms of oil, it's also the center of the world. So yes, it's driven everything else out of public consciousness, but it's also driven governments out of consciousness. Let me give you, and this is good for the gentleman from the security agencies. This is inside American security. This is something that it's not a secret for sure. It's not classified by any means, but it's not very well known. The American stockpile of weapons, usable weapons that the Americans could use in a conflict if America got into a direct conflict, is virtually depleted. Why? Because we gave most of it to Ukraine. And we didn't increase production. So when the Israeli conflict happened, virtually all that was left is being sent to Israel. So when Biden says, if you attack Rafah, we're going to stop giving you weapons, Netanyahu is also terribly aware that the amount of weapons you can give is very finite anyway. There's going to be a cutoff point. And so we might as well invade Rafah because pretty soon you're not going to have any weapons to give. And that's a reality. So yeah, it's a great question, but to answer it there are many levels.
We have 3 more students, Harisu and Muhammad Tabish. I would ask Tabish first. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. And please introduce yourself as well. Tabish?
Yes, so thank you so much. I'm Mohammad Tabish. I'm a PhD candidate and I'm studying digital platforms, AI, and crisis communication. So my question would be very specific. Professor Kaplan, how do you see the shaping of narratives and the use of modern communicative tools on both sides? Your analysis has been very balanced. So I would like to hear how you see the use of modern communication technologies in this whole crisis and conflict since 8-9 months. Thank you.
It's not my specialty, but here at the Danube Institute, we do a podcast, which you can catch on Spotify or the Danube Institute website, Apple Music, that kind of thing. And it's called Reflections from Budapest. We had a guest on yesterday, so it hasn't been posted yet, but the guest is the international spokesman for the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And his job as spokesman and head of their public diplomacy unit is to push the Israeli narrative. And in talking to him, he said a couple of things that were very revealing. One is that they are playing catch up. And now we're not talking about the big networks like CNN or Al Jazeera. We're looking at the area of social media and the war of ideas as it's fought on your telephone. And he says we're simply constantly behind. And there's two reasons. They have many, many more outlets than we do. And they post constantly. They don't necessarily do any verifying or fact checking. And we insist on doing that. So however true that is, they are far behind in the war of ideas, in the war of narrative and counter-narrative. Right now it is, and again, as I say, it's not my specialty, but my observation is that it is the Hamas narrative that globally has taken hold. After the destruction in Gaza, the Israeli narrative is largely falling on deaf ears. So even when they have truths to say, nobody wants to hear them. And that's for the global community kind of a disaster. Not to be on one side or the other, but to simply say that there's no one narrative, there's no one truth. And if we are to understand, and for me, I'm a historian, this is important for me, to be able to create a credible, documented history of a conflict. There has to be a truth. There has to be, if not a truth, multiple truths. You have to be able to see true from false, and not just narrative and counter-narrative. This is the post-truth era. If everybody has their own truth, there is no truth, because every man and every woman can create their own. And Hamas is better at it.
Simab has another question. Harisu, let Simab ask her question, and then you would ask your question. She has, I think, follow-up question regarding the first one.
No, my question is a bit different from the previous one. So I was going to your work on fifth wave of terrorism, in which you have noted that the main characteristic of the fifth wave of terrorism is the inclusion of women and children in it. That how the terrorists or terrorism involves women and children, and specifically related to how women are raped. So you right now in your session, you mentioned that the roles Israel and Hamas are playing are different because Israel is a state, but Hamas isn't. And that's why states behave differently. So does it give Israel a legal right to do whatever it wants? For example, the Western media hasn't even once said Israel that it is committing an act of terrorism, because the tactics are same on the both sides. So how does it how do the narratives are different in regard to Hamas or Israel?
There's two answers to that, and it's an important one. One is the academic answer. And if we got into the academic answer, first I would bore you. And second, it is some very specific definitions. You can read my stuff. I think it's all there. Let me go to the more important part of the question. States cannot act like a terrorist group or a non-state actor, depending on how you want to define it. There are international laws and international rules. If we're talking specifically about sexual violence, Israel has been committing it for a long time, well before October 7th. The historian Benny Morris, who is an Israeli, actually went into the Israeli archives and found a great secret from 1948. And that secret was that there was a systematic pattern of sexual abuse of Palestinian women as a way to get Palestinians to leave. So it's been going on a long time. In conservative Islamic culture, as we know well, reputation, honor are all very important. So what Israel does is both evil and clever. They use strip searches and they use public nudity as a way to shame. They don't need to rape. It's happened. But they don't need to, because they can destroy a person, not just a woman, but her family, her community, through the use of shame. It doesn't have to go to sexual violence, and it's still defined as sexual violence. What happens in the Israeli prisons is sexual violence. It's been going on well before October 7th. As a state, they are bound by international laws and covenants, which they themselves have signed. So yes, the crime, I think, is greater. The responsibility is greater. That doesn't absolve Hamas or any other group or any individuals. I'm just publishing a piece now, and it's a really extended piece that talks about sexual violence in conflict-related sexual violence. It goes back to World War II, and it finds 7 distinct forms that it takes as a weapon, not just as always happens in a conflict, just things that simply happen because of war. And in recent years, it has become a primary weapon. And I'm not just talking about the Middle East. In Africa is where this tactic was really perfected with huge violence. It began in the current wave of terrorism, which is the 4th wave, not the first, to get to a little bit of academics there, in Serbia, in the heart of Europe. So it's not something that is unique to one religion, to one region, to one tribe or one group, but it's a very increasingly effective tactic of warfare. And what makes it increasingly effective is its public nature. A rape that happens inside a house is not as effective a tactic in intimidating people as one that happens in front of a family or one that happens in front of a community. And even then, it's not as effective as something that is streamed on social media and shown to the whole world. So it's become an important tactic, and it's not just Israel, it's not just Hamas. It's a global tactic. You're seeing it in Ukraine on the grand scale. And it's not just because of sex. It's not just because of gratification or because men do what they do. It's a tactic. It's planned, and it's, to use a New York Times term, it's weaponized. I'll send it to you when it's done. It's if you want to read something that depressing and that long, I'd be glad to send it.
Now we have 3, I think we will take 3 more questions. And sir, you have already given us a lot of your time. And Harisu Muhammad, we have a Nigerian student, Harisu Muhammad. Please unmute yourself and ask your question. And then we have Mariam and Aisha, they would ask a question. Haris, please ask your question.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for this opportunity. And you know, we have different word pronunciation between Asian and African countries. So my question is that how can individual and communities worldwide contribution to promoting a peaceful resolution and supporting those affected by the conflict? And also, and the other question, how can social media and misinformation be addressed in the context of conflict, reporting, and propaganda?
Let me address the second one, and I'll ask you to repeat the first one because I didn't quite get it. But the second one is on social media. Wait, let me do the second first, and then
Okay,
come
sir.
back and tell me the first. The beauty and magic of social media is that it's completely unrestricted. Even Telegram will occasionally drop a channel, but it'll pick up somewhere else. So ultimately, social media has its own narratives. There is no known cure for misinformation, but there is a difference between misinformation and propaganda. And this is putting on my academic hat again. Propaganda is a story told by a state or a non-state actor. It has a specific narrative, it has a specific target or specific target audiences, and it supports a government policy or a government staying in power. Misinformation is not centrally directed. It often looks the same, and it often has the same effect, but it's something that is more organic and comes from non-state sources or from covert state sources. And then we get into the whole story of the covert use of propaganda and misinformation. And if we do that, we're going to be here for hours and hours. So please. Okay, the first question, though, I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. I said, how can individuals and communities worldwide contribute to promoting a peaceful resolution and supporting those affected by the conflict?
That's a wonderful question, and I don't have an answer. To be perfectly honest, my focus is so much on terrorism and violence that reconciliation is a next step. You have to end the violence first, and then reconciliation. And I simply don't know very much about it. How can the world community contribute? I don't know. I'm sure that there's a way, but I think you'd have to ask somebody who is expert in that area to answer that. I simply don't know. I wish I did.
I wish we all did know about it. So we have another student. She's a PhD student. Mariam, please ask your question. After that, we have another question. Aisha, I think. Mariam, please.
Thank you so much, sir, Professor, for your insightful session. Sir, my question is about critical perspective and a post-colonial perspective that offer very valuable insight on understanding the dynamics of power and historical narratives in shaping international responses toward conflict or conflict-like situations like the present Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So drawing from this perspective, how do power dynamics and historical narratives influence international community response to this conflict, particularly in terms of framing and legitimizing actions by different actors, and how might these dynamics inform future policy approaches for conflict resolution and peace building efforts?
Wow. That is a brilliant
Thank
question.
you, sir.
It would be a great topic if you cut it down quite a bit for a PhD dissertation, for sure. You're looking at structural issues. And structural issues not only in the area of information and perception, but also in the area of statecraft. And the problem is these aren't the same. Governments react according to their interests. And the kind of question you're asking mixes interests with values. How do you build a constructive narrative? How can the world of states react and work towards the resolution of intractable conflicts? And I don't think that the science is there. I hope you're able to contribute to it in your dissertation research. But right now, the science simply isn't there because there are conflicts that are primordial. In Africa, tribal conflicts are primordial. And African states were not built to accommodate tribal realities. And so what follows is decades of instability. The Middle East is very much the same. The idea of states, the creation of states, is very new, and it's very Western. So you have states and their populations who see in primarily different directions. When I was in Karachi, I asked my students a single question. It was the same question I asked when I was in Riyadh and Dammam and Jakarta and virtually everywhere else in the Islamic world that I've ever lived or taught. And the question is this: if you had to choose, if you were forced to choose, would your primary loyalty be to the country or to the tribe or to the family? And 100% of everyone who was being honest said tribe, clan, family. The state is a Western construct. What you're looking at is immemorial. It goes back to the beginning of time. How can you construct a narrative that will build towards a more positive outcome, a better state, a better world? Nobody knows yet. Which is why if that is your dissertation topic, it's incredibly important. I don't have an answer to it, but inshallah you will. And it's the best I can do. It's such a good question. I wish I could give it a good answer, but I'm not sure anybody can at this point.
I
But
think
it's a brilliant
you
question.
beautifully described by linking affiliation of every single human being to its tribe and its clan and its family rather than the state.
But remember that
yes.
Before doing that, just as a
Sir,
footnote
please.
to that, you're right. But when asking the very same question in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, you get exactly the opposite answer. It's the state. Because we don't have tribe. We don't have clan. We have ethnicity, but the ethnicity mixes.
Yes.
Nobody's homogeneous. So our loyalty is to the state in the West, and in the non-Western world, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, that's not the case.
Yeah, we are still stick to our core values, or you may say the family system that we have, the social fabric we have here.
Of course,
we have
that's what makes that question so difficult.
Yes, absolutely. We have another student, Aisha. Aisha, please unmute your mic and ask your question. Aisha, can you hear us? All right. Mahmoud Noori?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, please ask your question. Unmute yourself, introduce
Okay.
yourself, and ask your question. So we have some
First of
Afghan
all,
students here as well.
I love
thank you,
Afghanistan.
sir, for giving me. Yes, thank you, sir, for giving me chance. I am Mahmoud Duri, last of Afghanistan, currently studying the University of Lahore. My
Mahmoud,
question,
please speak in the mic. Mahmoud, speak in the mic. We cannot hear you clearly. Mahmoud? I think he
The
lost
problem
somewhere.
with virtual classes.
Yes, that's terrible sometimes. Miss Aisha, we have. Can you hear us? You can ask your question. Or Mahmoud, where did you go? Yes. So we have a
can you hear me now,
question.
sir?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yes.
Thank you, sir. As you know, I'm Mahmoud Nuri, and I'm belongs to Afghanistan, currently studying at the University of Lahore. I'm curious about the Zionism and what some of you, sir, Dr. Jeffery Kaplan said before. And in the light of recent Gaza war, how the principle of Zionism promoting unity and compassion help address the rising threat of homophobia and contribute to the efforts for peace and understanding in conflict zones. That's why I'm a little curious about this.
Mahmoud, we just understood a little bit of the beginning of your question and a little bit of the end of your question. In the middle, when you talked about Zionism, what do you mean by that? Can you repeat that part?
Yes, sir. I'm curious about Zionism and Islamophobia.
Okay. What about them?
It's all right. I think he has some
I would ask
internet
Mahmoud
issue.
if you could actually write the question in the chat. It might be easier because we're having real problems with the mic.
Yes. Mahmoud, could you please write down your question and send it to, yeah. Please write your question, Mahmoud.
If Aisha's there while he's writing, we could do that.
Yeah, I will ask Aisha. So, sir, I would like to just make a comment, and we have talked about it a little bit. We did not touch upon it like in detail. Specifically, even Seema mentioned in her question about the act of terrorism and it's being affiliated with Islam. Even you mentioned about it. Hamas, whatever Hamas did on October 7, it is an act of terrorism. There is no doubt. Killing civilians is an act of terrorism. But at the same time, we see from the Western perspective, they have 34,000, even more than 34,000 innocent children and women, the majority have died in this conflict. And don't you think it is an act of terrorism as well, rather than we just link it to what Hamas did on October 7th is an act of terrorism?
Let me answer that. Now I have to put on my academic hat for that. And by definition, terrorism is opposition.
Yes. States
commit terror against their own population. The population of Gaza, at least since 2006, when Israel pulled out, are not in Israeli territory. So from an academic perspective, my argument would be, no, Israel is not guilty of terrorism. Israel is guilty of war crimes of one state against another people. Now, whether that has any real importance, given the dead bodies, I would say no, beyond the academic perspective. But terrorism has to mean something. It has specific definitions. And the reason I get very sticky about this is this. If you use a term simply to demonize an idea or a people, that term loses meaning. So when I was young, in the West, if you wanted to delegitimize somebody's argument, you would say, oh, you sound like a communist. You must be a communist. Later, it became, you sound like a terrorist, or you are a terrorist. Terrorism has a meaning. It's neither positive nor negative. It's a tactic. And there have been four distinct waves of terrorism. The anarchist wave at the turn of the 20th century, the wave of national liberation after World War I, the New Left wave in the 1960s and 70s, and now the religious wave. So you have to use the term correctly, especially as a professor. Use the term correctly and say, yes, Hamas did commit terrorism. Israel committed war crimes. Is one worse than the other? No. They both result in innocent civilians being killed. But in terms of definition, they are two different, they are defined differently. But their result is exactly the same, except for this. Terrorism is oppositional, which means it doesn't have the means to carry out the scale of destruction that a state can, which is why this is important. What Hamas did was terrorism. What Israel did are war crimes. And the ICC in The Hague is looking into that now. And they will indict Netanyahu and Israel for what's happening in Gaza. But even they don't define it as terrorism.
Right.
It's war crimes.
So we have Mahmoud's question. He wrote in the chat. And we have Aisha online now. Aisha, please unmute yourself and ask your question, and I would read Mahmoud's question. Aisha, can you hear us?
We keep trying.
Just 1 second.
Sure.
So Mahmoud wrote his question. He says that in the light of recent Gaza war, how can the principles of Zionism promoting unity and compassion help address the rising tide of Islamophobia and contribute to efforts for peace and understanding in conflict zones?
It can't. Zionism is not a universal idea. Zionism, it has many forms. There's religious Zionism, there's secular political Zionism, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not meant to be a universal theory or a universal idea. It means the return of the Jewish people to what they, in their view, the Holy Land. So does it contribute positively or negatively to any other conflict or resolving global conflicts? No, it does not. It's not designed to do that. Islamophobia is a prejudice, a belief in the mind of some non-Muslims that Muslims are inherently violent, that they're terrorists, or that through immigration they're trying to take over Europe, which is what the Hungarian government strongly believes. But it doesn't make it true, and it certainly doesn't contribute to peace and unity throughout the world. They simply don't work like that. They're not designed. Zionism is not designed for it. And Islamophobia is simply a prejudice, like anti-Semitism. It's not designed to resolve anything. It's designed to foment hate and fear.
I think Aisha is offline and she cannot hear us. Her name was called again and again. And I think we can end it here if we do not have any other question. So Professor,
Can I ask you a question?
Oh,
Can you hear
Aisha,
me?
she's back.
Aisha, please introduce
She
yourself.
was.
So are you talking to me?
Yes, you're.
Doesn't sound like Aisha. Do
It
Okay.
doesn't sound like Aisha. Please introduce yourself first.
Yeah.
it? No,
So,
it does.
first of all, thank you so much, Professor, for such a wonderful meeting. My name is Mughis, and I'm just a bachelor student, so I don't have any fancy question to ask. So here's my question. Well, I think when any person with power makes any mistakes, the coming generation have to pay for that particular mistake. So what, if we look back to the history, what we started doing with Jews, what Hitler doing started with Jews, then after Israel came into being, we means the global world declared some sort of war. We all know what happened. So my question is, what they are currently doing, is it not justifiable?
Let me make sure I understand your question before trying to answer it. You're saying by the context of everything that's gone before, what they being the Israeli Jews or the Hamas, the Muslims of Hamas are doing are justified by history? I'm trying to understand
Yes.
the question exactly. Very simple answer to that. No. My argument would be this. As we began this class, we talked about the context. 1948, 1967, the terrible things happening in the occupation. The result of that was the reaction to that, I should say, were two intifadas, which were uprisings. These were absolutely justified. And honestly, I supported them like a lot, especially since I was living there, very much in the Palestinian community. And so, yes, those were justified because they were acts of resistance against a state that was doing wrong. Is it justified to go into Gaza, into southern Israel, to the kibbutzim, and to this music festival where very innocent young people are listening to music and kill them, rape them if you believe it or not? It doesn't matter whether you do or you don't. They're dead. Is that justified? Hell no. Is what Israel does in the West Bank and Gaza justified, even before the war? No. One context doesn't justify the killing or the oppression of innocent people. It simply doesn't. Now, if Hamas had come across the border on October 7th and engaged the military, great. They're soldiers, kill them all. That's their job. But these innocent kids at this music festival, and the people, there's a great irony of the people they killed in those kibbutzim, because that was the Israeli peace movement. A lot of them were trying to build not only bridges to Gaza, but one whose entire family was killed was investing all of his money in creating businesses in Gaza for Gazans. This was the Israeli left, what was left of it. Now there is no Israeli peace movement anymore. They killed them all. That's the great irony of it. No, it's not justified. And the pictures you see on Al Jazeera every morning, that's not justified. If Israel wants to kill Hamas, go for it. They're carrying arms, they're trained, they can defend themselves. It's a war. And vice versa. If they want to kill the IDF, go for it. But you don't touch women ever, ever. It's against the rules. You don't touch children ever. It's against the rules. Soldiers fight soldiers, and they have since the beginning of time. But does history, does context, does anything else justify what happened on October 7th or what goes on in Gaza? No, never.
Fascinating answer. And it's whenever I listen to you, I just feel like that you just keep speaking and we just keep listening. And it reminds me of old days. It just reminds me of old days and the long sessions. And Professor, your coffee that you used to offer me, I loved it. And I loved your company and I learned a lot from you. And I hope all the students must have learned something new today. And because there was lots of information. And I feel like it's like listening to you is like we are listening to an ocean of knowledge. And
it's a very shallow ocean, I'm afraid.
Not at all, not at all.
Or like a lake.
Life experience, your travels, and throughout, I don't think that there's any place on the map you haven't been there, and tells its own story and own experience.
Never been to Antarctica.
One day.
Inshallah, one day.
Inshallah. Professor, it's been an honor to have you, listening to you. It was fascinating conversation, and thank you so very much. And I would love that if you have more time, and I would want you to engage with my students again and again. Thank you so very much.
Oh, I'd love to.
I'm indebted to your
thank you
time. Thank you.
For the students, thank you all. I really enjoyed this. It was really like being back in Karachi again, and I do miss it for all of the ups and downs of Karachi. I do miss Pakistan quite a lot. Thank you all.
Inshallah, next time I would invite you to Lahore, which is you would have quite new experience here, inshallah.
It's quite different than Karachi for sure.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Take
care.
Bye.
And have a good day. And everyone, thank you so much for joining. Take care.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.